we have a very interesting panel, and we'll try to make this all very, very an interactive dialogue. So my name is Carolyn Nguyen. I'm part of the policy team here at Microsoft. And first of all, I want to thank all of you for making it here. I'd like to thank the panelists in particular also for making the time to participate in this discussion, and also Isoc Dc. And would like to introduce David Bjork from Isoc Dc. So this is the third part 3 of a series that we are co-hosting and organizing, addressing the different parts, the different dimensions of internet fragmentation. We've had 2 already. One that sets the context for internet fragmentation, a second one which looks at the technical lens. You have the summary reports for that, so that provides some context and background for this discussion. And then this one is focusing very much on the business issues, and we have an illustrious panel to address the different perspectives on that, and also how do we address some of the pressures that are being caused by that. So welcome, and with that, I'll turn it over to David.
Thank you, Carolyn. My name is David Viors, and I'm the Executive Director of the Greater Washington, D.C. chapter of the Internet Society, or Isoc Dc, and the co-chair of the IGF USA. We are very grateful to Carolyn and Microsoft for hosting this event. In our work, we cover many issues confronting the future of the Internet. None could be more vital than maintaining the end-to-end interoperability that allows any person to connect to any person anywhere in the world. We are very grateful to have such a distinguished panel to discuss this, and we're very grateful to have a partner such as Carolyn Nguyen at Microsoft. We're going to be continuing our internet policy offerings over the next year and trying to increase them. We encourage your support and your participation. Thank you very much for coming. I hope you enjoy this wonderful panel that we've put together.
Great, thank you. And also, I forgot to say, also thank you for those of you who are joining us remotely online as well. Welcome to all of you. Great. So thank you. You all have the biographies of our panelists. So what I'll do is I will just do a quick introduction and some highlights in terms of the perspectives that they'll be speaking from today. So to my left here is Ted Dean, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Services from the U.S. Department of Commerce, the International Trade Administration. Ted has been leading efforts to develop trade policies and that are really aimed at ensuring competitiveness of the U.S. services industry. This is really a major topic and a major context for the business dimension of the internet fragmentation discussion. He also led the U.S.-EU negotiation on the Privacy Shield. So we'll have a lot of insights to partake with us with respect to the impact of internet fragmentation. And by that, I mean in terms of disruption in data flow on economic growth and sort of balancing the need to balance between growth and some of the issues that are coming up in terms of governmental concerns. Next to Ted, we have Jonathan Zuck, who's the president of ACT and the App Association. In this conversation about the business impact, the voice of the SMEs is really, really critical, because when we start to look at economic growth globally and nationally, SMEs are really the growth engine. And Jonathan is really an expert at that and can give us a lot of insights in terms of the impact and how to address some of the issues, as well as address some of the local and national concerns in this conversation. Next to Jonathan, we have Robert Pepper, Dr. Pepper, as he's known in the industry. Pepper is really kind of multi-stakeholder in one person. He's been with industry, he's been with government from FCC and NTIA, he's had academic appointments, so we kind of get the whole package in one person. and he's been very, very involved in areas of technology and policy in addressing connectivity challenges, and this is what Pepper's role is at Facebook as well. So we look forward to his perspective, primarily business, but you'll get a sense of where he's coming from when he speaks. It's very insightful. And then we have Carolina Rossini, who's the Vice President of International Policy at Public Knowledge. Carolina has participated and led many of the negotiations, multilateral and multi-stakeholder, with really emphasizing the issue of human rights online and the importance of the open internet, which is a very, very important global conversation. So we really look forward to that global perspective and in making sure that, you know, the human rights, the freedom of expression issues are taken into consideration as we look at internet fragmentation, especially the business lens. So welcome to our illustrious panel. And I also, in looking out at the audience, I also see quite a few experts, and so would love to have your participation as well in this conversation. What we'll do is we'll have a series of questions for the panelists to take us through the flow, and then we'll open the conversation to those in the room as well as online. So there is increasingly evidence linking the importance of the open internet and economic growth. And from the first panel that we did, Ambassador Sepulveda essentially said, you know, the open internet is the backbone of the digital economy. And increasingly, there's evidence that this is the case in terms of, you know, we look at the McKinsey report, we look at the OECD report, and then, you know, the various ministerial declarations, the G20, the OECD ministerial, from the UN WSIS plus 10, there's, you know, sort of recognition of the importance of the open internet. So, Ted, if I may ask you to address, you know, sort of the implications of internet fragmentation, which in this case is defined very narrowly as any interruption to data flow on the infrastructure on the global and national economy.
Sure. Well, thanks, and thank you all for coming, and thanks for Microsoft for convening us here. It's a pleasure to be here. I think it's, you know, it's an accepted truism that companies depend on data. I think it's not quite as widely accepted, but equally true that companies depend on the movement of data. And certainly in the work that we've done, and I'll talk a little bit about Safe Harbor and Privacy Shield as an example of this, I think the mainstream sort of popular view of this, certainly at times in Europe, was that this was a Google, Microsoft, Facebook issue, or this was a handful of big internet companies that were at stake, and not fully appreciating the breadth of industries, the breadth of companies that are impacted. And so I think one of the things, and you referenced some of the same studies. I have got my quotes from the McKinsey study and stuff like that, which I'll put aside. You've highlighted some of the reports that are out there that make this point. But you know, I think what our experience was, the kinds of companies that approached us on these issues, that approached us on Safe Harbor, approached us on Privacy Shield, are in all types of companies, in all industries, all aspects of the economy. And so, you know, a small company that opens, and I'll use the Europe example because it's what I've spent the most time on, but opens a 2-person office in Berlin and wants to move their employment file back to the United States, suddenly they're dealing with data flows. Certainly not just internet postings, but any kind of customer data you have to be able to move across the internet. Any kind of warranty or product safety data, or you know, any aspect of any business is relying on the movement of data. Sometimes I've heard the arguments portrayed that, well, the next big opportunity is the Internet of Things, and that'll be much less problematic because it's not personal data. In many cases, that data is also commingled with personal data. So you may have terabytes and terabits of data, which is about a turbine, and no one's too worried about that data crossing a border. No one's too worried about the privacy protections around the turbine. But you might have, for example, a log of the people who've serviced the turbine. And so all of a sudden you're actually including data which does have privacy protections. You run into some of the places which are the most sensitive for data flows and are creating new challenges for companies that are doing business and moving data. So I think, you know, our experience on the Safe Harbor negotiation was really, I think, one of, for us and for many companies, of sort of looking into the abyss of what happens if data doesn't move. And I think it's fair to say that we and most folks in industry didn't like what we saw. It wasn't a very appealing view of the future as we looked from October last year and after the Schrems ruling. And of course, I don't want to overstate where we actually were at that moment. And with friends from Europe perhaps watching online, we recognized that there was sort of forbearance provided by data protection authorities, and we recognized that there were other legal ways of transfer and all the complexities of the particular issue we were working on. But it's also true that companies did sort of, for a moment, look into a future where, wholly use your expletive. What are we going to do next? What happens if the next domino falls and we're really not able to transfer data? And I think, again, companies didn't like what they saw. Fortunately, in that case, and I'm not going to spend too much time. I've talked, I think, in this room about Privacy Shield in the past. I'm not going to spend too much time on that. But I think, we did get sort of out of the woods on this very narrow issue. I think one of the reasons this convening is so valuable, and one of the reasons we're continuing to spend so much time on this set of issues is, we invested a ton of time, a ton of energy over 2.5 years in tackling this with Europe. The rest of the world wasn't standing still. There are issues like this around the world. There are countries who have not sorted out from a policy perspective what direction they'll go. And I think a real risk of the kinds of issues we faced over a number of months with Europe playing out in other places. And so certainly, we hear from companies, I think, a desire to look more sort of affirmatively and positively into the future. What are vehicles to tackle these issues before they become crises, as they did in the transatlantic case, and how can we tackle them? But I think, across the board, the finding was companies can't function if they can't move data. And, economists can model that in a number of different ways and come up with a really big number, but basic business functions don't work without it. And so I think, important that we're here discussing it and looking at maybe some of the solutions. So, stop it.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you for bringing out the point about the fact that the impact of cross-border data flow is a phenomenon that will affect all sectors. You mentioned manufacturing as well, and primarily the large companies. Jonathan, I'll turn to you then to discuss in terms of the impact on the SMEs, and just two things to get you started. From the OECD, there's a statistic that says 85% of young entrepreneurs say new technologies are critical to enable innovation and business processes, as well as a number of other reports that says, technology democratizes and lower the barriers of entry for SMEs. So perhaps you can help us address some of the impact of internet fragmentation on the SMEs.
Yes, and let me share your appreciation for everyone that showed up in the rain, and for Microsoft and Isoc for hosting this important discussion. Small businesses have really benefited from the internet, in many ways much more so than large businesses, because they make it possible to behave like large businesses. And I think that's one of the key factors of the success of small businesses on the internet, is that as soon as I threw up a website, my website looked just as good as Dell's website. Remember, Dell's website began with an order leading to a printout coming off of a laser printer that they then walked over to their order entry system and entered it in. That was Dell's first online ordering system, wasn't LinkedIn. So my website looked just as good, right? And so the same thing is happening in the app space. And now the same thing is happening in the data space as well. One of our members, Steve Forte, is a serial entrepreneur. He was involved in bringing Zagats.com on board, and built that system. It cost him $1 million in venture capital to bring that on board. He did another company called Corbis, which is essentially Expedia for shipping containers. Finding distressed inventory, here, put in an extra container here or here, and then get it cheaper, et cetera, and work the same way. And that startup cost him $10,000 to bring on board. And it was the same kind of engineering question, but in one case, he had the ability to use a centralized data source called Amazon Web Services, right? So the fact is, I can act like a big business, even though I'm a small business, if I have a low barrier to entry, if I have a low cost to entry, and the ability to scale as needed. I don't need to create the infrastructure necessary to accommodate the peak. From the outset, I needed to build, buy, or rent the capacity necessary just to get started, right? And that has been critical to the success of small businesses around the world. And so if you think about it, though, where that economy of scale comes from is very often from the centralization of data, right? And the ability to put the data in one place, not having to have data centers in every country, for example. I had a member in the Netherlands And they had a system in Luxembourg for tracking the health of cows. There were little sensors that they put on their ears, and they could learn an awful lot about how the herd was doing from these sensors on their ears. And they ran into data protection problems that made it impossible to bring the data out of Luxembourg about the cows. So somewhere between people and turbines, there's cows that still have data rights as well, right? And so suddenly that application couldn't scale, right? So it became kind of famous in Brussels as the cows in the cloud example. But so these are very specific examples to small businesses, right, that are able to leverage the capacity to make use of platforms, whether it's the app ecosystem or whether it's a data ecosystem. So it becomes critical. So when you end up with a system in which more localization is occurring, the people that are going to be hurt most are the entrepreneurs and small businesses. And ultimately, I think the small businesses, as we often see quoted, are the keys to economic stability and economic regrowth after a recession, right? A big company fires 100 people and 100 small businesses hire one of them, right? That's the model that we've all come to rely on. And small businesses have come to rely on the leverage offered them by these platforms, whether it's for distribution of their software or whether it's for data. And a lot of what we've enjoyed right now about the app ecosystem, particularly in the United States, we're often talking about it here in Washington. Part of what's great about it, from the standpoint of a lobbyist, is that I have members in every single congressional district, right? That wasn't always the case when I was just representing software companies, right? There was high concentrations of them around universities and sources of funding, right? Now I have members in every single congressional district. And that's important for me as a lobbyist, but far more important for you as looking at the entire economy, because you have this distribution of economic resources throughout the country. And all of that is a function of leverage. Now, part of that is also a function of what we might call phase one of the app ecosystem, which was local apps. You loaded them into your phone and they just worked. They didn't really go back to a server for much of what they needed to do. And that's what made it very easy to start using them. It's what made it very easy for them to build. You look at phase two of the app ecosystem. Where are the next million apps going to be? They're going to all involve client-server access to information. The next step up for the entire app ecosystem, we're done with the beer drinking apps now, right? And so the next step up is going to involve access to data. And so for that distribution of innovation to continue in the United States, it's going to be imperative that they're able to continue to leverage the wide distribution of marketing, excuse me, and easy and low-cost access to data. So anything that causes fragmentation is bad for small businesses, it's bad for you.
Great.
Would you like to be a pepper too?
So now we've got, cows in the cloud, well, that's what we'll
Apps that drink beer.
apps that drink beer, So thank you for, Jonathan, for really kind of bringing out the importance of the SMEs, in particular, kind of the cornerstone of building out that digital ecosystem, which is really absolutely necessary for any growth of the digital economy. I want to change the perspective a little bit, right? So far we've been talking about the impact, the business impact of fragmentation of the internet infrastructure. Many of the conversations and many of the studies that look at internet fragmentation also talk about application layer fragmentation, which often comes about due to commercial offerings, specific applications, etc. And there's some perception that business offerings violate sort of the internet end-to-end principle in terms of enabling users to access all applications. What Dr. Pepper, what I'd like to do is to ask you to address some of these issues, and also to what extent should internet fragmentation at the application layer be a part of the overall, fragmentation debate? Is there a conflation between network and application layer fragmentation? But I also would like you to address what you have found in terms of this income inequality paradox and lay that as kind of the context for the need to really provide connectivity to everyone.
Yeah. Thanks, Carolyn. And again, thanks, David, Carolyn, Isoc, Microsoft for doing this. This is the third in the series. And so let me start with that last question, because it goes back to where Ambassador Sepulveda started our first conversation on the policy issues related to fragmentation. And you know, Danny said, look, the biggest threat towards fragmentation is the fact that we have over 50% of the people on the planet not connected. Right? So if we really want all of the benefits of the internet, everybody has to be connected. And that actually is, you know, it builds on what Jonathan was saying. For example, just in India, building on a small business, there are 2 million small businesses in India that have Facebook accounts, and they promote themselves as small business on Facebook. More than half of the hundreds of millions of Facebook users in India access on a regular basis those small businesses. So this is about really, you know, small business connecting into supply chain, right? But it's also small business talking to consumers, consumers talking to small business, that leads to the economic activity that you talked about, right? And we just, two colleagues and I, John Garrity and Connie Sal, published a study in this year's Global Information Technology Report published by the World Economic Forum looking at the economic impact of data localization, and it supports, I mean, obviously, it's not a good thing, right? And it has negative economic consequences. But in terms of where Ambassador Sepulveda was starting in our first fragmentation session, the fact that more than half of the people on the planet are not connected is a huge problem to be solved. Why? Again, some of the other research that we did was a year ago led to what we called the income inequality paradox. We know that when people are connected to the internet, it's an income multiplier. And we know from all the literature, the research, and that if a country gets over about a 24-25% adoption rate, as more people, there's a threshold that they have to be at. As more people in that country connect to the internet, it helps that country grow its GDP, and the income inequality between countries shrinks. It closes the gap in income inequality between countries. The paradox is that as more people in a country connect to the internet, it increases income inequality in that country, right? Intuitively, why is that's kind of like head scratching? Not if you think about it, because connecting is so important. The people who connect improve, and the people who are not connected do not improve as rapidly or at all. So as more people connect, the gap between those who are connected and online and those who are not grows. So in the name of equality, we're not going to tell people to disconnect, right? That's just not.
Yeah, let's level them.
Yeah, exactly, right? We're gonna, you know, everybody's going to be equal. Nobody's going to connect. No, that's not the answer. So there's really only one answer. Everybody has to be connected. So, you know, what we need to do as a community is focus on that question. So, and there's a lot of activity now, which is really great, because even if you go back only 2.5, 3 years ago, the connectivity agenda in the developing world, as well as in the U.S., was really not high on the agenda, especially in the global conversations. You know, next week there's the Isoc, IEEE, World Bank, Global Connect meeting here. There are projects globally looking at closing the adoption rate. And part of that, by the way, I mean, even just this week, NTIA released its report and said, you know,
the majority of the people in the U.S. who are not connected because they don't see a value to be connected. It's not affordability. There's some of that, but it's not that it's not affordable. It's not that it's not accessible. It's not that there's no signal. It's not that it's there. They say, why do I need to be connected? So one of the, the first step in that is actually awareness. What is the internet? Especially in the U.S., but then also when you're looking globally. It's, what is the internet? Why is it important? How do I get on? And then as people get on and they increase their use, we can call the intensity of, internet use, right? It adds to the relevance. And that's where I think, you were very polite, by talking about separating application and technical fragmentation. The questions about things like, zero rating, right? There's some people tell, zero rating is terrible because, the reality is that at the applications layer, right, there are people who do not know about the internet. The question is, how can we introduce people to the internet in ways that are pro-consumer, right? So they're not anti-consumer and not anti-competitive. I mean, that's what we should be worrying about. And there are ways in which that can be done, and there are a lot of, sort of experiments with things, related to, zero rating to do that. And when you think about, a very common example of zero rating that people don't really, perceive or understand as a zero rating service, it's a two-sided market, is your Kindle. Right? You buy a Kindle, right? You download books, you pay for the books, you read the books, you love it. Magic, right? How does it get there? Well, actually, Amazon has a contract with AT&T to pay AT&T to provide the connection so that the end user's paying for the content, or just they bought the Kindle, they're using that, but they're not paying for the connection. It's a two-sided market. It's an example of zero rating. Is that anti-consumer? No. Anti-competitive? No. So there are ways in which that can be done in a very, I think, very constructive way, especially if what we want to do is to attack this really important and globally huge question of how do we introduce people to the internet that have not been introduced to it? How do we create relevance? And then, as they use more and the relevance goes up and the intensity increases, they migrate from, the zero rating services. They have, packages of things and so on. And the key is, and if you look at, again, you've been polite because you didn't say, well, what about, Facebook Free Basics? The fact is that, Free Basics is designed for providing connectivity at sort of low data rate connection rates, because in a lot of parts of the world, in the 30, 40 countries where it's actually been deployed and it's very effective, it's a skinny connection. So there are technical requirements that are published, and any application provider can use Free Basics as long as they meet the technical requirements, right? And basically, it's, you can't have, super rich photos or video because it won't go over the network. And by the way, Facebook's own application also does not have video. I mean, it's just the same for all of the applications. Right? And again, trying to introduce people to the internet to attack this awareness problem. How do we close the adoption gap with the over 4 billion people who are not connected? So I think there's a really important distinction between, and the technical, our second session on fragmentation was about technical fragmentation, right? And what you do not want is the inability to have everything connected. I mean, to me, that's really sort of the basic sort of prerequisite, necessary, consideration, that you have to have the ability to have connectivity so that if people who access the internet and applications and content want to be connected. They have the ability to be connected and get their applications, their content from anywhere. And that also, I mean, Carolina is going to talk about the importance of freedom of expression and human rights. And, you know, it's really important for social as well as economic reasons that we have that connectivity. At the applications layer, right, there are different business models. You know, anybody, for example, should be able to access Netflix, but Netflix has contracts with different studios for different movies, and not every movie is available on Netflix. But everybody should have the ability to get Netflix, right? But you go into business models, you know, we can debate whether you think it's a good business model, but the fact is the Hollywood studios and movie producers globally have release windows. And so they decide that they want to release a movie first in the US or first in Europe, and then moves in different places. So if you're a Netflix subscriber, you can get different movies in different parts of the world. That's a business decision. That's not, in my mind, fragmentation, but there are people who call that fragmentation. I don't think that that's actually what we're talking about. That's not going to destroy the economic and social values that Ted and Jonathan talked about.
Thank you, Pepper, for really, you know, sort of clarifying the difference between the importance of having connectivity to the applications and the business models, and also laying out very clearly for us the importance of that connectivity in terms of the economic, the socio-economic importance of enabling that connectivity and separating that out from a business model discussion, which it is a anyway. So Carolina, let me turn to you to really, you know, for the perspective from the civil society on this question and some of the issues that you see.
Sure. Thank you, Caroline, for the invitation, and it's always a pleasure to be with colleagues in an early rainy morning. But I think actually the life of civil society gets very easy when we are the same side of some companies, because the efforts of lobbying and advocacy we do can actually, we can sum efforts on some issues. And I don't want to go deeper on the privacy side, but I will go more deeper on the freedom of expression and economic rights, because at the end of the day, all of those are human rights. And I like a lot, the West did a report on mapping fragmentation and the types of fragmentation, and I think that type of report is extremely important, exactly to not put a lot of different cats in the same basket. I don't know if that's an American expression.
It should be an American expression.
It is now.
I think we need a list of all the different expressions on this panel.
And I like a lot the nature, the almost an ontology that they built with some characteristics that actually have been part of our life since the internet was developed and since the protocols that enable open internet were developed. So I like a lot the notions of integrity, unified, global, and properly governed root and naming numbering systems, interoperability, universal accessibility, the reusability of capabilities, and permissionless innovation, and if you like, detrain the generative web. And why I bring those things? Because actually, if we apply those concepts in each internet layer, you might understand that some of the things mentioned here today or in previous panels, they are fragmentation or they are not. So what type of fragmentation we are talking about? Are we talking about the fragmentation of the technical infrastructure, which is one of the most dangerous ones when you see some countries trying to develop an alternative DNS system? Or are we talking about the user and the consumer experience of application and content being delivered to that person, right? And I think those are extremely different sides of the coin and implications of different business and government initiatives. And in that sense, for example, it's really important for us to have common standards for apps to participate, because that's not just about freedom of expression, it's freedom of the economic, to exercise and benefit from economic rights, which are also human rights. Another thing that Pepper mentioned next week is with the Global Connect initiative, right? So for a while, even if that can be perceived by some as a distraction from bigger issues like encryption and surveillance, it still is a good positive agenda to be built because we now have a lot of countries coming out of the WISIS process paying attention again to the importance of connectivity. So as civil society, we really want to engage on that, and we have been with a lot of colleagues since the early beginning, say, okay, we want a connectivity, but what type of connectivity, right? So that's why we are developing a series of standards to really, when the international banks fund those initiatives, because a lot of that money comes from international aid and international banks. So US gives money to the banks, or Germany gives money to the banks, and then the banks, international banks distribute to countries, generally in the global south, Latin America and Africa are big receivers of those loans and grants. That initiatives that are developed take into consideration privacy by design and freedom of expression by design, which means no alternative DNS system. So if a country want to develop that, maybe the funds should be restricted in some way, right? To allow people to actually access the same educational resources and cultural resources that people from the global north access and things like that. Because otherwise, you do have a fragmentation on the side of the user experience that we are talking about. So, but that is just a new name to talk about things like marketing strategy of geo-blocking and distribution, which is not just something from the content industry. Even pharma does that with mapping, right? So it's a new name to talk about old practice. So I think we should actually leave that aside and really think about the root of the problem in terms of having a huge, for example, Chinese population not able to communicate clearly with American or a Brazilian population because their governments do some blocking there, not just creating a new internet, but also putting so many restrictions to companies, which don't create just barriers to multinationals, but also create barriers to the Chinese innovators to reach out to potential consumers. I think that has changed a little bit over the past few years with Alibaba and all things like that, and I think the World Bank with the Digital Dividends report brings great examples on that sense. So I think these are some just of the points I want to bring for us to really try to separate what is fragmentation and the serious impact that can cause to users and what's just a new expression of old business models that need to adapt themselves to the internet. Of course, we have to keep an eye on the competition and consumer rights side. Some countries are more strong on those as others. So for example, Europe supposedly is stronger in privacy than a lot of other countries. And a lot of folks say, because of privacy protections, you have to localize your servers, right? But that can be bad for a lot of users and consumers in less democratic countries. If some less democratic countries follow some localization as example. So in the Marco Civil in Brazil, for example, we won the battle against localization. Of course, civil society had a different narrative from companies. Brazilian companies were saying, we don't accept this, our costs will multiply by 5, and we need to keep using the servers we use in Miami. But for civil society we don't want localization because then the government can access our data and our conversations without the process, because until recently that was not guaranteed, and it still not is in some cases, right? You see the WhatsApp block in Brazil so many times, having some relationship with that and jurisdiction issues. So I think we need to separate the pieces, and I really recommend reviewing this web mapping of fragmentation issues and implications, because I do believe that they do a great work on separating the cats from the basket.
Yeah, and in fact, that was with the Bill Trey. I mean, in our first session.
Yeah.
Actually, which was great. That sort of set. That was I think the best analysis so far of trying to make concrete, as you point out, this word fragmentation. What does it mean? It means different things, in different ways.
Yeah.
And I thought they did a really, really terrific job of both the taxonomy, but also mapping that, and then talking about the different types. of fragmentation.
Agreed, and thank you, Carolina, for bringing that taxonomy and the need for for that taxonomy and the separation into the discussion. Completely agree with you that it is really important, because I think when the conversation on internet fragmentation has moved along quite a bit since we started thinking and discussing this about a year ago, when the term internet fragmentation was not as clearly delineated. And there's still lots of confusion right now, and I think that was really the reason why David and I started looking at, can we have a more informed discussion on the different dimensions of this topic and kind of start to take the issues apart so that we can understand what the issues are and how we can help policy stakeholders to arrive at some of the more appropriate or more responsible or more informed policy making. Carolina, I want to build a little bit on what you started to get into, which is we do understand the need to have connectivity and all of the benefits that were addressed by each of the panelists here. But so what are the pressures that are causing fragmentation? We hear a little bit from Ted and from Carolina with respect to the privacy. We also hear a little bit about the differences in approaches to privacy, in particular in your case. So I want to put that question out there so that we can have a more more evidence on what are the pressures. And also, so privacy for sure, and I also want to turn to Jonathan because of the IANA transition conversation. But Ted, maybe we start with you?
Sure. I mean, I think it's a great conversation to be having. It is the right place to start. I think one of our challenges, sort of specifically in our work around Safe Harbor, was that we were addressing multiple drivers of fragmentation at once. And we really had to kind of disentangle what it was we were talking about in order to be practical with our European colleagues and come up with a solution. And so, in my case, in the work I was doing on, but I think some of others in the room, probably this is true as well, national security and the reaction to the surveillance disclosures is an element of this conversation. It's a hard debate to have when it's a vital debate to have, but a hard debate to have when it's mixed together with some of the other elements. But that's one piece of the story. How do countries deal with legitimate policy aims like protecting their citizens' privacy and deal with data flows at the same time? That's a really important discussion to have, but you've got to sort of look at that discussion for what it is. I think part of the challenges on that one, clearly protecting your citizens' privacy is a legitimate policy aim. How do you do that in a way that enables trade and the economic growth that Dr. Pfeffer was talking about? I don't think we've quite figured out in international context. In Privacy Shield, we in one very narrow set of circumstances came up with one solution. I don't think we've quite cracked that more generally, and that's what a lot of our focus is on right now. And then I think also there are elements of this which are simply about protectionism. And anytime you're having a conversation where all of those three things are on the table, but you're not sure what card somebody's playing at any one time, it's obviously pretty hard to come up with the solutions. I mean, one of the things that struck me about Dr. Pfeffer's research is, if whether it's the U.S. and EU or U.S. and Brazil or countries that are developed and leaders in these areas are not getting it right together, we're setting a really rotten example for the places Dr. Pfeffer was talking about, where just getting people online has huge economic benefits. And one of the things I didn't hear you say was the economic benefit came from more server farms in the country, or came from even, I think the entrepreneurship comes, but it didn't come from necessarily the app developer was in the country. It came from, if I understand the Facebook in India example, a business owner who's now able to reach a customer or reach someone on Facebook, and sort of taking a traditional business that's there already. They didn't have to design the app that did it. They were able to leverage that. Well, what does that mean? That means that people have access to that market. They can use the best and brightest idea from anywhere in the world. They can move data around to get it. The app can be hosted somewhere else. And there are economies which are large enough, and this is obviously one of the reasons discussion about China is so complicated, that they can get scale within their borders. There are a lot of other countries which, if they follow the lead of folks who are talking about building their own ecosystem sort of at a national level, they're just not going to be at a scale to attract the level of investment that's going to make that work. And so, I think just puts all pressure on all of us to sort of get this right at a kind of macro policy level, because a lot of countries, a lot of small business owners in countries are really depending on that this works and that they can tap into this opportunity.
No, absolutely. And I think part of what I take from your point is that the importance of putting these different issues on the table at the same time, as opposed to also, just having, for example, for a long time, the privacy conversations was on its own in silo versus, instead of taking all of these, the privacy pressure, the protectionism, the importance of economic, discussing all of that at the same time. Carolina, you wanted?
Sure. I think one important thing to understand is like the historical cycle we are in terms of the impact of the Snowden revelation. Right? We have a few cycles in
Do we have
internet
sound
history.
effect for that?
After that, why I'm bringing that? Because after that, you have an increased clash of sovereignty trying to say, I am the boss in my backyard, right? And why we have to think very carefully about the implications of that is because if governments want to assert that sovereignty in a way that do not even follow established due process, the population of that country will not have arguments to repeal that, neither the population and government of other countries. It's very, like, for example, what I'm thinking of the Microsoft case now, Iris, right? US trying to access data outside US. Not entering the merits or if it's right or wrong, I'm just thinking about the geopolitics implication of going outside the MLS system, which is the multilateral agreement on exchanging data for investigations and other purposes. And proposing other new draft treaties, which is important. We need enforcement to be more efficient, but going outside a certain system without fixing that certain system that applies to the rest of the world can create a lot of geopolitical issues and sovereignty issues that diminish all the efforts on things like the privacy shield and the development of privacy laws in a lot of countries, because you have that external pressure that causes countries to assert their sovereignty in a way that they don't even understand the consequences. Why is that? A clear example is in Brazil with the cryptography and WhatsApp example. There is, in one of the annexes of the most recent case, there is a technical expert saying that the government can break the cryptography. So the judge keeps saying, don't tell me cryptography cannot be broken. You don't know it can be broken. My technical expert said that can be broken. So also, the lack of understanding plus the geopolitical policies takes us to these unreal cases and environments and consequences. So I'm glad we have experts working on this, because we need to understand what one certain domino will cause layer down on the geopolitics pressure. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so this is some great examples. So very often you have, I tend to think of, we're really talking about sort of government actions that's leading to fragmentation. And that's largely what the conversation is. And from a business perspective, how does that affect, right,
it's
business?
the pressures that are leading
and so, the barrier that Ted talked about and Jonathan talked about. So when you look at government actions, I have sort of found it useful to think about those that are, we would desire, right? The aspiration is well-informed and well-intentioned, right? So you have well-informed, technical experts advising government policymakers, and you come up with good decisions. Frequently, though, you have well-intentioned but ill-informed, right, decision-making. one example of that was I was having a conversation, and this goes to the broader localization pressures, right? So it's not just data localization, it's data center localization, it's manufacturing localization, et cetera. And I was having a conversation with a very large Asian country, a policymaker from a large Asian country, not China, who said, he was going on about why we need local data centers, and he was started talking about for, security and privacy. And then about halfway through the conversation, he said, well, it's really about, we want local data centers because it's going to create lots of jobs and we want to be able to tax it, right? It's about taxation. And without actually understanding what the impact is on the business and the investment climate in their country. They want more foreign direct investment, but they think the way to get it is to impose those requirements. And anybody who's ever been to a data center, most of the jobs are actually the construction jobs building it, but once it's built, there's 5 people. And, basically they're mechanical engineers making sure the air conditioning still works, right? A couple of, people running around if a server fails. It's not a lot of jobs, right? But they want it for taxes. So, in my mind, and you see countries that have localization requirements for manufacturing, increasing the costs of products for their consumers that reduces adoption. That's, again, counterproductive. Again, it's sort of well-intentioned in one space because they want to create jobs, but ill-informed in that actually it harms consumers in different ways. So we're seeing a lot of that, and frankly, we're seeing some of the security issues used as rationales for what other things, with other purposes, that fall, frankly, into traditional non-tariff trade barriers, right? Protectionism. And there's some really interesting conversation that Carolina and I were part of with 2-3 weeks ago in Geneva with trade experts who were pointing out, there may be ways, for example, that, data localization and data center localization, cloud localization, actually may be a violation of the WTO services agreements having to do with data processing. So, these are not new issues, but they're being done for other reasons. Last thing is, talked about well-intentioned, well-informed, well-intentioned, ill-informed. Then, frankly, there are some countries that are very well-informed but ill-intentioned. And then there are those that are ill-informed and ill-intentioned. And, that's where you get real chaos.
We count on those.
Jonathan, your
Well, I mean,
perspective on
I
this?
think I'm slightly less diplomatic than my colleagues on the panel. I think there are 2 reasons for fragmentation and a lot of excuses. The 2 reasons for fragmentation are protectionism and censorship. That's it. Everything else is an excuse. So if we're looking at the causes of fragmentation, it's what excuse was given to proceed with a policy to fragment. So the best thing that we can do as policymakers, I believe, is avoid giving people the excuse to fragment. And so that's what the Snowden revelations were. They weren't really revelations to the people that are then using them as an excuse to fragment. They weren't revelations to them, but it was an excuse because it had been made public. And I think that the attempts to block the IANA transition at this late hour represented another potential excuse for fragmentation at the technical level that Carolina talked about in terms of the DNS. There are certainly well-informed bad actors that would like to see the open internet be less so, be more under United Nations style support where they can coalition build among governments and get different kinds of regulations passed that they can't in the multi-stakeholder process that exists. And what better way to give them the political capital they need to bring that about than to demonstrate how we're not to be trusted, that we think we control the internet or that we think that we need to keep control that we have. So it's actually giving people the excuse to fragment that I believe is the greatest cause of fragmentation on the internet. The reasons are still censorship and protectionism. It's really that simple. And so that's why I'm very excited. This is very topical because just last night, the House of Representatives approved the continuing resolution that was approved by the Senate that didn't include blocking the IANA transition. So fingers crossed that may go forward and America might go back to being a country that keeps its word, which I think is a really exciting thing in the world of excuses, right? And that is the world in which we live. There's people that are waiting for an excuse to go against what is the natural flow of things, which is toward openness. And I think that the degree to which we damp down the excuses is the degree to which we keep an open internet.
Thanks, Jonathan, for your very blunt remarks as usual, but very informed. I want to move on to the last question. I'm going to take Pepper's, sort of taxonomy that says it's the well-intentioned and ill-informed that, we're never going to be able to change the actions and the perspective of the ill-intentioned and well-informed, or ill-intentioned and, well-informed. So I think that a lot of this conversation and dialogue like this are hopefully, and Ted, you may have a different perspective on this, targeted at the bulk of the countries that are well-intentioned but ill-informed. At least I'd like to think of it that way. So from your different perspectives, what are some of the, Ted, you mentioned, sort of vehicles to balance or to put the information out there so we can start having more well-informed dialogue on what the issues are. There's been many who says, well, the digital transformation is just beginning, and so there needs to potentially be a set of digital economy principles that can start to guide some of these negotiations. The last question is really about your thoughts on short-term and long-term call to action that can start to address some of these issues and balance some of the priorities and considerations, legitimate policy concerns from national governments that you've all been bringing up during the dialogue, and still enable us to get at that enabling of the digital economic growth globally and nationally. Any order? Who would like us said?
I mean, maybe I'll focus on privacy because it's what I've spent the most time on. And I think it is one of those places where there is a legitimate and understandable policy aim, yet we haven't figured out how to give folks confidence they can meet that aim and not restrict data flows. I think that yes, there's a need for more discussion on it. Yes, there'd probably be a benefit to sort of an effort to develop principles that more people came on board on. I mean, I think sort of from my vantage point, a lot of this is just at a very practical level, proving it works. And so, and I'll go very micro first. In my office, we're focusing on making sure Privacy Shield works. European citizen has a complaint, knocks on the door of their regulator in Europe and comes to the Department of Commerce. We're going to be in a better place having this discussion 2 or 3 years down the road if there's a track record of those issues being resolved than if there's not. And so let's prove that it works in practice. In trying to get ahead, that's a reaction obviously to a crisis. Trying to get ahead of the next crisis, we're working on developing a system called cross-border privacy rules in the APEC context, which we think is really powerful because unlike Privacy Shield, which is bilateral and really one way, it's about EU data flows to the United States. Whatever you think about the way the balance of privacy and data flows and confidence in data flows work, it can't be the future that every country in the world is going to unilaterally evaluate the privacy protections in every other country. That's a disaster. And so what we've tried to do in APEC is create something that is 21 economies came to consensus around a set of privacy principles. We've put in place a program where companies certify that they adhere to those programs. And again, it gives folks confidence that when their data is transferred to a certified company, they believe in the privacy protections, the system works. Again, it's got to work in practice. So I think, yes, the principles are there. We need to, efforts to negotiate and build towards those principles and more things. I also think there's a significant piece is a really practical solution. MLATs is another example. How does it work in practice? Make sure it delivers in practice. If we do that and people have confidence that it works, you're having a very different conversation if you're looking around at something which at a fundamental level your counterpart believes it doesn't work. So.
That's great. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I've always said that the key to innovation is experimentation, and the success of small businesses is, in fact, a mirror of the failure of small businesses. Right? That people try things, they fail, they try something else, they fail again, etc. And preserving an environment in which people can keep trying and failing is what leads to so much success. And so that I think is something that we have to continue to fight for and continue to maintain an environment of experimentation, because that's what is what allows for a kind of unexpected innovation, if you will. And you know, it's funny. I worked a lot with, or I see Carl here from NetChoice, worked a lot on this IANA transition, but they also have maybe one of the best periodicals that is for well-intentioned, uninformed policymakers that is called the IAWFL list that I think you should all check out, because I think it's a perfect example of going through and looking at well-intentioned legislation or initiatives and saying, whoa, 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 wait, here are the unintended consequences of it. And so when you talk about communicating more about, this person put this, you know, this idea in my head, and I'm running down this track because I was given this cause to head in this direction, taking a step back from that and looking at what the unintended consequences are for the sort of open internet, for, you know, unfettered innovation and experimentation is really what's critical, is taking that second look before you leap forward. And I think the IAWFL list is one of the best documents to point people in that direction.
So first, I mean, Ted was responding, I think not implied, not explicitly. Take away the excuses, right? So this is Jonathan. You know, it's just, there are a lot of excuses, take them away. But I actually think that, again, focusing on sort of the well-intentioned, ill-informed, there are opportunities to work and actually help inform, right? And sometimes that means slowing down a little bit, because it means partnering with government officials who, you know, most government officials are not techies. They don't understand how it works. They don't understand routing. You know, when India proposed, well, we're going to keep all routing in India, from, you know, if there's any, you know, packets flowing from, you know, one location in India to another, we're going to pass a law that keeps all those packets in India, without having any understanding of how what the network architecture is and how the internet works. How that doesn't make any sense. Yeah, most of the time they will stay in India, but other times they're not. You know, the fastest route is going to be maybe outside and then back in. But working and informing, and by the way, there were some, quote, engineers who turned out not to be internet engineers who were, you know, saying that this could be done, and it was really getting the people who understand, really smart internet, you know, people in India to start having those conversations, explaining why that actually is not going to work. And sometimes you just have to, you know, figure out what the concern. Always ask the first order question: what's the problem you're trying to solve, right? And if you can tease that out, and it's about taxes, we're not going to solve that, right? But if it's really because they think it's going to be about, you know, something that's either safer or you know, more jobs in data centers, I mean, there are ways you can actually work with those officials, and it's about building trust and a long-term relationship, and helping inform the process. And it's a lot of work, right? And it needs to be done. And more companies, frankly, have to make the investment in people to do that. And it's not the traditional advocacy. I'm focusing now outside the U.S. in the emerging countries, because, like Jonathan said, you know, the concerns is you don't want to move from a multilateral, or from a multi-stakeholder to a multilateral approach. The multi-stakeholder approach works, but there are a lot of governments that are nervous about that, and they think it doesn't work. So we have to do is, in a world of the UN of one country, one vote, small countries that don't have a lot of capabilities in government because they're small governments and that maybe a small ministry that's dealing with these issues, we need to work with them because their vote is just as important as a big country vote when it comes to these multilateral forums.
And well, two things about building on separate comments. It's not just about the policymakers, right? I think it's about also the consumer and the user and the population in general. We need to inform that layer, and if you don't inform and you don't have that layer, including civil society, on your side, you might face what Facebook faced in India, right? Because people were not informed exactly what were the consequences and the rules of the game in the case of free basics. And the same is happening now in WhatsApp in many countries that were blocked. WhatsApp, I think, is blocked in Egypt and a bunch of other countries. But one of the things that could be important to do is to join forces with civil society activists and even the press and say, you, as a professional sector, need this encryption to protect yourself, to protect your sources, et cetera, because we do have activists and journalists dying in every country, including those countries that WhatsApp has been blocked or is struggling with bad press, right? In Brazil, there was like a 3-page news on a very important magazine last week saying WhatsApp enable criminal activity, right? And this brings the population against you without realizing that same population is losing rights by losing some platforms and some apps. So I really think it's a bottom-up and a top-down approach. You have to inform and work with the policymakers, but you also have to inform and work with academic, civil society, and the population in general, proving the value that the internet brings, because otherwise you're going to have those things clashing and you're going to be in the middle.
Great, thank you. Lots of insights there. Sorry that we only have about 10 minutes left, but do want to open the conversation to the audience. Mike?
And then there's a couple back over here.
Mike Nelson with Cloudflare. This has been a really rich conversation. My only complaint is we didn't have enough argument because we're all on the same side. But one of the cats in the basket that we really didn't discuss is security standards. And you did talk about privacy, but we do have countries out there that are trying to improve the security of the internet in their country by mandating that certain standards be used. One of the first attempts was in China with the WAPI standard, an alternative to Wi-Fi, which was pushed aside, and the Chinese finally realized that wasn't going to work. But I'd be curious what you think about, and whether you worry about, countries coming up and saying, well, everybody's got to use this encryption standard on their websites, or everybody's got to use some special form of Wi-Fi, or everybody has to use iOS or something. I mean, how do we fight back against that argument? Because I think Jonathan's right. Protectionism and censorship is the main reason, but sometimes security is something that people use as a reason for putting in place laws.
Yeah, security is not the only reason that some countries are using for local standards. I mean, there's a fundamental principle that actually has worked for over 30 years in the internet, and it's actually worked a lot longer in other industries, and that global standards are demonstrably better, more effective. That global standards for security, right, whatever, as in terms of the industry developed, right, actually are way more effective than when we've had, sort of fragmented. And frankly, I think you're right. A lot of it's, giving benefits of doubt, well-intentioned, ill-informed, but I think in some cases it's the reverse. They're non-tariff trade barriers. And I don't. I mean, you probably have more visibility into those. The question for those online was whether I see any cases bubbling up in terms of authentication. I just don't know.
There we go. Carl Zabo, NetChoice. By the way, 2 days to go on the IANA transition, so here's hoping. We also have the iAwesome, which we rolled out, which is legislators who actually got it right. We tried that to be a little more positive. We started the conversation with Privacy Shield, and I know sometimes it's easy for everyone to run to the issue of privacy. I teach privacy law. But one of the other issues that I'm hoping is being discussed as part of the general discussion as part of fragmentation is legacy laws that prevent free expression. A good example would be in Germany, I'm Jewish, so they have certain laws about what you can say about certain events that occurred. France has requirements that a certain percentage of all content be French content. And I'm only using Europe as kind of one example, but there are many other countries across the world that have similar requirements. What are we doing on a global scale to try and kind of amend these legacy laws and kind of protectionist laws for culture? And coming from America, we have, First Amendment and Section 230. So for me, it's kind of an anathema to have such type of requirements. So what are we doing on a global scale to address those issues?
I think it's a very tough question because, for example, at the same time that you have these efforts for interoperability and openness and etc., you do have a lot of international caveats and human rights trying to respect local culture and diversity. So a lot of companies that have to deal with this, like Netflix, they do have a certain percentage of local content, which does not mean that they cannot have everything else there. I was actually discussing that last week with a Netflix colleague on the requirements in Brazil, because we also have the same percentage to support the development of the movie industry in Brazil. And I think not even trade agreements, are not being able to deal with that. One thing that we didn't touch much, just like the WTO comment, is that actually a lot of times the way to go to pressure countries, my public citizen colleagues will hate me now, but it's to deal with the barriers to trade agreements, because you now have a lot of, in the CDT, for example, non-localization requirements and privacy schemes has a barrier, and that might be important for some countries and might be a point of pressure, because Peru will join, it's part of TPP because they want to sell and have access to the commodity to sell coal around the world, right? So that's our way, as a strategic way to push forward some openness and requirements through the world.
But look, the reality is different cultures have grown up historically with different attitudes towards different, to certain things. So even just, you start with Europe, within Europe, what you can see on broadcast television in terms of nudity in Germany is not the same as in Spain or other countries, right? And when you're online and you have global networks, I mean, you do want to be, a good local citizen, and there's the need to balance local culture. Where it gets difficult, which is, where's the line between supporting and respecting local culture and, censorship of, political speech. And that's a really, the extreme cases are easy to identify. But there will be times when it gets close to the line and it requires some balancing and some judgment, but the global, there is no single global culture except maybe sports, right? So it is a very difficult question, because from the human rights perspective, you do want to respect local culture. On the other hand, you don't want reduction in freedom of expression.
Yeah.
So,
I was just going to say, I think the greatest enemy to censorship is actually content and economic opportunity. And so a lot of what we need to do is make sure that the reasons to allow more people to see more exist. And so one of the things that I think is most interesting that's happening mostly recently is the translation of the internet into other scripts, for example. And so more Chinese language content that's actually in the Chinese alphabet or Cyrillic or Arabic, etc. When you put content and economic opportunity that follows on from that content and make that available, then the opportunity cost of censorship goes up. And I think that that's really the biggest thing that we can do is keep this free flow of information and make it as accessible as possible to many people. Because if the opportunity cost of censorship gets too high, then the incentives for governments to engage in it goes down. That's what I think is the best.
Great. I'd like to take one last question, actually ask the panelists indulgence for another 5 minutes.
Sure.
We'll take the last question and then ask each of you to answer and also give your closing remarks as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Lee Howard, Charter Communications. Jonathan had said that the key to innovation is experimentation. The lens that I keep looking at things through in terms of the business aspects for fragmentation is a fear about the lack of IPv4 addresses. It's very hard to conduct experiments if you can't get an address to communicate to other people. And making it incumbent on the newcomer, the new entrant to the market, to find a way to do translation or to buy addresses or to choose one address family and not necessarily be able to reach everybody else seems like lots of routes to failed experiments. The Ministry of Industry in Belgium found that the lack of IPv6 support was actually a competitive disadvantage, competitive disadvantage that it was providing an anti-competitive climate to new entrants to the ISP market in particular. And so they now have the highest deployment of IPv6 among users of any country in the world. So Facebook's done fantastic work in supporting IPv6, good job. Cloudflare's helped a lot. But my question is, what else can we do to make sure that we're not fragmenting that we're not fragmenting the possibilities for innovation on this particular angle or lens?
So this actually came up in the technical panel, and there's agreement that we need to have as rapid a transition as possible. And a lot of, again, in the U.S. and domestically, globally, there's 3 legs to the stool. One, the networks have to convert and be able to support D6. 2, you have devices. There's no new device being deployed that is not D6 capable. And then once you get those 2, you then have to, you get the applications. And all 3 of those things need to move forward. And again, I'm focusing on sort of emerging markets. One of the things that can be done to accelerate that, but first, one of the things not to do is to have governments, sort of come in and want to have new IPv6 regulation. That's only going to confuse things, delay things, right? Because the train is moving. So I'm an optimist, but I say I'm an impatient optimist. So the question is, it's about acceleration. And a lot of emerging countries, the biggest thing that can accelerate is if the governments themselves convert their own networks to V6, right? So there are governments that are saying, well, we need to accelerate, we need to regulate it, we have to require it. So hold up the mirror, are your networks capable? Let me check, I don't even know. And they come back and they say, not yet. So I think in emerging, so number one, that's one thing to do. Second, it is about large organizations, large enterprises, converting, and the applications, right? Because if you have applications that people want, and they now have their new devices that are V6 capable, not all, but most of the networks have converted. Most of the networks are capable. So it's really about creating the demand side for this. And, look, we're going to be running dual stacks for a while. We want to limit that to the greatest extent possible and really accelerate. So there's some things I think that we can do, that we need to do. And I think, the apps providers need to step up as well.
I'll take that challenge.
Yeah, I know you would. That's a hand up.
I think there's an expression in Washington, D.C., OBE, overtaken by events, right, that is used a lot. And I think that this is going to be another one of those examples. I think that there's a lot of stuff happening in the fringes to bring about incremental adoption of IPv6. And we're looking at who's hoarding the IPv4 addresses, because there's all kinds of caches of them that are not being used, et cetera. And there's attempts to get incremental engagement. I think the Internet of Things is going to leapfrog all of that and create that demand side consequence that will render most of these efforts.
And also for security interoperability.
That's right. I think security will play another role in that as well. But I think that the big mover in this is going to be refrigerators that all need
literally. Yeah. So I'll ask you for your closing remarks for the panel at this time.
Sure. I mean, we're a little over time. I think we had a really great discussion, so I appreciate the opportunity to speak with this group. I mean, I would just highlight one thing I think came up from the audience, which I think is very fertile ground for continuing this discussion about fragmentation, which is the security and cybersecurity element of it. I think both in terms of governments in the ill-intentioned category misusing that as a driver for policy, but also as the threats and awareness of the threats expand, what does it mean for confidence in the internet and the sort of consensus on some of these issues? And I think that's a significant risk going forward, so more to talk about.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, and thanks again for everyone for coming out in the rain, and thanks for hosting this. I guess the one thing I would really reiterate is that the key to small business and entrepreneurial success is a low cost to entry and the ability to scale. So that looking at any particular policy that you're trying to evaluate, look at whether it's causing an increase to the cost to entry. And that's not always clear to see, but that's often the thing that's going to really be a detriment to innovation and entrepreneurship. So, whether it's a platform that's free but it's limited in its capability, then, take a step to say, is this a lower barrier to entry that creates a foot in the door, as Dr. Pepper mentioned, and if it is, then that's something to protect. Low cost of entry and the ability to scale. Thanks.
Yeah, and the low cost of entry and ability to scale is important also from the user end, and go to, complementing that, because it also supports the, large business, small business, is we need to get the next 4 billion people connected. Until they are, even if there's no technical, fragmentation, that we're going to have a global population fragmentation. And we need to focus on the people piece of this as well. So everybody has to be connected, and that's also why some of the things that, we're doing, focusing on at Facebook, are some of the newer technologies that are going to bring core networks, backbone to places that have no core network, UAVs and solar planes and so on. And that's serious, really serious, and some of the things that Microsoft is doing now, in Kenya. How do you bring internet to people who do not even have it available? And then how do you help them become aware of it? How do you help them get connected? How to use it, to benefit from it? And so it's both supply and demand, but we're going to have the lack of the benefits being universal and ubiquitous until everybody is connected. To me, that's essential. At the same time, not instead of, the same time, we're fighting these excuses that are being used for other reasons to not have a global open internet.
Thank you.
And I think to end, the same elements I brought in the beginning that actually support a lot what my colleagues also have said in terms of the elements of integrity, openness, accessibility, and I would include transparency and accountability there. They are essential elements to also support users to benefit from their human rights, being those economic and cultural rights, but also freedom of expression and even privacy. So while we do have to keep things open and interoperable, we also have to make things transparent and accountable if you think about privacy rules. And the governments are bound by that through international agreements, and companies over the years have voluntarily adhered to some of those. So if you follow the UN Business and Human Rights Initiative, companies trying to play a good role there on implementing those human rights through their services and products. So I think keeping those core elements in mind is really important moving forward. through awareness raising or innovation or whatever is necessary in a certain country.
Great. So I would like to thank all the panelists for a very rich discussion this morning, and also for really setting, the importance and the context of the economic growth and the importance of providing connectivity, but also laying out clearly the challenges as well as the principles that we need to think about as we look at how to enable that goal. Would like a hand for you and also for the audience for staying with us. Thank you very much.